Hey, it's Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini. I post weekly crafting, cooking, and organic gardening videos right here on my YouTube channel. In this video tutorial, we're moving right along with our Victorian Modern Quilt along, and I'm actually going to be teaching you how to make the second block in this quilt along, which is block number 2. If you're coming across this tutorial randomly, we're working our way through a series of videos on making this Victorian Modern Quilt using Andover Fabrics Victorian Modern line. I designed this quilt, and this week we're teaching you how to make block number 2. If you want to join in on the fun, make sure that you click right here to watch the first video in the series, and that way you can watch all the videos in order. And this week I'll be giving away another 3 ruler set from Easy Quilting by Simplicity, and also a fat quarter bundle of Victorian Modern offered up by Andover Fabrics. To start block number 2, we're going to begin with these 2 fabrics, which are going to be our corner blocks here. So 2 of one fabric and 2 of the other. So we'll be cutting out 12 of each of these, but first we need to press the fabric nice and flat. Let me share a quick tip with you. A lot of you, I noticed in the last video, said that you often have times like you think you cut the fabric the correct sizes, but then when you start to sew them together, they move on you, or they kind of stretch and they get distorted, and so they ends up being a little bit bigger than the size you cut it out at. Well, what I like to do is that I'll hit it with some spray starch. And you can be quite generous with this stuff. This is going to stiffen up the fabric nicely. And what I find is that when I cut the fabric, it's nice and stiff. And then when I put the pieces together to sew them through, it's almost like 2 pieces of like a thin paper. So the fabric doesn't stretch as much on you, and it'll help you keep the size that you cut them at. Okay, it's nice and flat, pressed all out. We're ready to cut. From this, we're going to need 12 squares that measure 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. So it's just like you guys did in block number 1. First, we clean off the edge. Okay, and then we're going to take our 6.5 inch ruler, measure to the 4.5 inch mark. So I'm lining up my ruler down here on the straight edge of my fold, right? This is where the fold is of the fabric. 4.5 inch mark right there. One of the lines on the ruler on the fold of my fabric right there. Slide my ruler up. Make sure it's the 4.5 all the way up. There's one strip, and we're going to need 12. So we can get 8 from one strip, so we need to cut out a second strip. My 4.5 and cut. And I have my 2 strips. And now, just like we did in block number 1, we need to trim off the selvages and then go back and cut 4.5 inch at a time. So there are my 12. You can put this piece away, and now let's cut the other fabric. Now this fabric, you may see that I required a larger amount than normally just for those squares. This fabric is also going to be used right here for these cornerstones in the sashing when we get to that point, okay? But for now, we're going to use it to cut out 12, again, 4.5 inch square blocks. So far we've cut 12 of this fabric and 12 squares of this fabric. They all measure 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. So now we're moving on to the next fabric, and I want to show you what it is that we're going to be doing with it. We're going to be doing these little side strips here. So you can see there's 2 on each side around that center square. So that means each square is going to need 8 of these. Okay, 2, 4, 6, and 8. 8 times the 6 blocks, you're going to need a total of 48, okay? And this is the fabric that we're using. And these, since they're going to be rectangles, the measurements are going to be a little different. It's going to be 4.5 inches, and then the other dimension is going to be 3 1/8, and I'll show you how to cut that. So I'm going to clean off my straight edge here, and then we're going to cut just like we did, 4.5 inch wide strips. And then we'll turn them and cut the other dimension from that strip. So 4.5. So now in the opposite direction, remember the fold is over here and the 2 freshly cut edges are right here. So I'm going to keep that together so I can cut 2 at a time as usual. And now we're measuring 3 1/8. Now if you recall from the last tutorial where I was teaching you about measuring the 7/8 on the ruler, this time we need 3 1/8. So we can see from here to this red number is 1, 2, 3, and then 1/8 just means one little tick mark over, bigger than the 3, because these are 1/8 inch increments, right? So just 3 and then one little tick mark over from there, and that's your 3 1/8. And all you need to do is make sure that it's going all the way up. Up this way should be 4 1/2, and it looks perfect. And that's the piece that you need. So continue to do that. Remember, just one little tick mark over from the 3. And so you see how many strips I was able to get out of the one 4 1/2 inch wide strip that we previously cut. I can get 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13, and then you have this left over as waste. So each one of these is doubled up, right, because it's cut on the fold. And then the last one, because it's on the fold, I just open it up, and it ends up being that big. You chop the piece you need, and then this is the excess, okay? So again, we got 13 from one strip. Now for this next fabric, we're cutting the same like we did from this one, except we don't need that many. So instead of 8 per block, of these we only need 4 per block. Times the 6 blocks means we only need 24, right? Because we said we can get 13 from each one, and 13 times 2 strips will give us 26, and we only need 24. So get my smaller ruler here, 4 1/2 inches. So same measurement going this way, right? We first start off with our 4 1/2 inch wide strips. Okay, so these 24 are cut now. Now the only piece that we need for this block is that center 8 1/2 inch square. Okay, cut selvages here. Now let's start laying out the block. So here's what it's going to look like, but now we need to start piecing it together. And if you can remember from block number 1, it's a very similar layout. So you are going to sew these together the exact same way that we did block number 1. We're going to sew these 3 together, these 3, and these 3. So I'm going to start pinning this one, pretty side to pretty side right here. Remember to use that scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. My next step is to sew these 2 here, these 2 here, and these 2 here. So I have all 3 rows here, and now we're ready to start combining them. So remember, we're just matching up these 4 points. Turn them over. Now here's something that you'll probably encounter more often than not. I didn't press in opposite directions, and I try not to think too much about it, like, oh, what way did I press the last row? Just press it in one direction, whichever can be the darkest fabric. If the fabrics are very similar, press it to any side. And then what I do is when I go to pin, if I see that both my seams are headed in the same direction, like here, I have the seam here going to the right and this one going to the right as well. All I do is I force it. So I'll leave one going to the right, and then this one, I'll just force it with my finger, make it go left, so that both those seams there, let me cut these threads so you can see better. So both of those seams are going to abut right at that intersection. And then I just put a pin through either side to help hold that in place, okay? And then afterward you can go back and repress this and just push it in that direction. It's not a big deal. On this next intersecting point, you can see again, I have both the seams going to the left. So all I'm going to do is keep that bottom one going to the left, and then the one that I have here, I'm just going to turn that seam to make it lock right there where it needs to with the other one, okay? Grab a pin and put it right through there. You can see this is the seam that I forced over this way, so just go back and hit it with an iron and make it turn in the direction that you need it to. No big deal. And the same thing here. And that's just my shortcut way of doing it. Let's open this up, and I'm just going to press these towards the center. So here's my finished block number 2. If everything was sewn and cut correctly, you should end up with nice points right here, matching intersecting points. If you didn't, say if this is your first quilt, don't worry about it too much, because if you're using these fabrics, the prints are so busy that they do a great job of covering up any sewing imperfections. So that's it. Block number 2 is complete. Your homework for next week is to make 6 of these total, and meet me back here because we're going to be working on cutting out sashing strips and cornerstones. And now here's the information on last week's giveaway winners. Congratulations to last week's winners. Good luck to those of you entering this week's giveaway, and I'll see you next time. Bye.